The night after the broadcast ended, Dean Martin did not go back to his dressing room. That small detail mattered because it told you everything about where the story was heading. In part one, we saw the public moment, the laughter that froze in the studio air, the careless words spoken by a powerful man in front of cameras, and the way Dean, calm as ever, chose silence instead of spectacle. But silence is not absence. Silence is a decision, and Dean Martin had made one. Hollywood after midnight had a way of telling the truth. The lights stayed on, but the smiles fell away. The same executives who joked loudly during the day lowered their voices at night. Waiters leaned closer. Deals were finished with glances instead of handshakes. Dean sat alone at a small table in a nearly empty lounge, a glass untouched in front of him, listening to a pianist play something slow and tired. His face showed no anger. It never did. But there was weight in his stillness, the kind that comes when a man realizes a line has been crossed, not loudly, not violently, but unmistakably. The injustice that night had not been subtle. It never was. It was wrapped in humor, the kind people used to excuse cruelty. The joke about Muhammad Ali had landed hard, not because it was clever, but because it echoed something older and uglier. The suggestion that greatness could not protect a man from being alone. The implication that dignity could be stripped by laughter. Dean had heard versions of it his entire career, aimed at different people, different times, always wearing a smile. But this one stayed with him, not because it embarrassed Ali, but because it revealed how easily power forgot its responsibility. Dean knew Ali only casually then. They were not friends in the traditional sense. They did not share long dinners or holidays, but Dean respected him. He respected the discipline, the courage, and the way Ali spoke with a clarity that frightened people who preferred comfort to truth. And Dean, who had spent his life mastering the art of appearing easy while carrying a private code, felt something settle in his chest that night. A decision, not to confront, not to argue, but to wait. Weeks passed. The world moved on as it always did. Headlines changed. Laughter returned. Ali fought. Dean worked. But the moment did not fade. It aged. And like all things that age quietly, it became heavier. Dean saw Ali once more in passing backstage at a benefit, surrounded by noise and admirers. Ali smiled at everyone, generous and unguarded, but when his eyes met Dean's, there was a brief pause, not awkward, not bitter, just aware. Dean nodded once, a small gesture, the kind men exchange when they know something has been left unfinished. The turning point came not in a studio or an arena, but in a room where voices were meant to be polite. A charity gala, expensive and carefully curated, the kind where morality was discussed as an accessory. Ali was invited late, seated poorly, treated like an attraction instead of a guest. The same laughter returned, softer now, more refined, but no less sharp. Someone repeated the old line, not directly, but close enough. Alone, inevitable, destiny framed as humor. Dean stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not look angry. He simply walked to the microphone that had not been meant for him and placed his hand on it as if he belonged there, which he did. The room quieted, not out of fear, but recognition. Dean Martin did not speak unless he meant it. He said that he had learned something in a long life of bright lights and dark rooms. That loneliness did not come from being different or outspoken or bold. It came from mistaking applause for love and cruelty for wit. He said that men who mock dignity eventually find themselves surrounded and still alone, because no one trusts a heart that laughs at another's humanity. He said that Muhammad Ali would never die alone because he had chosen courage over comfort and truth over approval. And then Dean stepped back, as if the matter were settled. No one clapped at first. They did not know if they were allowed to. Silence spread, thick and instructive. Some faces flushed. Some looked down. Ali did not move. He simply sat, eyes steady, breathing slow. And then quietly he stood as well and nodded toward Dean. No speech, no performance, just acknowledgement. Dignity restored without spectacle. Years passed again. Careers aged. Bodies slowed. The world grew louder and faster, and gentler men were often forgotten. Dean Martin died the way he lived, without drama, without apology. His funeral was private, respectful, attended by those who understood restraint as strength. The service moved carefully, memories shared in measured tones. Laughter was present, but softened by gratitude. Near the end, when the room believed it had heard everything, Muhammad Ali rose. Time had changed him. His body no longer obeyed him the way it once had. But when he spoke, the room leaned forward. Ali did not talk about fame or fights. He talked about a night when a man with every reason to stay silent chose to speak. He talked about how those words followed him for years, not as defense, but as reminder. That dignity is contagious. That courage does not always shout. Ali paused. The silence returned, heavier now, kinder. He said that Dean Martin had been wrong about many things in his life, as all men are, but about loneliness he had been profoundly right. The ones who stand for others are never truly alone. Ali's voice broke once, only once, and when he sat down there were tears, not loud ones, not dramatic, but the kind that come when justice is finally named. The camera would have lingered on Dean's empty chair if this were a film, but it did not need to. The dignity he carried had already filled the room, and in that quiet, morally complete moment, the story reached its end, not with revenge, not with humiliation, but with something rarer. Respect restored, silence honored, and a truth spoken so calmly that it lasted longer than any applause ever could. Long before the studio lights and the careless laughter, Dean Martin had learned what it meant to watch a room turn against a man without ever raising its voice. Growing up Italian in an America that liked its heroes neat and its outsiders quiet had taught him restraint as survival. You learned when to smile, when to step back, and most importantly, when to speak so little that every word mattered. That lesson followed him into Hollywood, into rooms where power hid behind charm and cruelty dressed itself as humor. So when the comment about Muhammad Ali was made weeks earlier, Dean did not react out of shock. He reacted out of recognition. He had seen this shape before. The world pretended to forget, but Dean did not. He carried the moment with him as he moved through his days, through rehearsals and meetings and dinners that felt more like performances than meals. People spoke around him, not to him, assuming his calm meant agreement or indifference. That was always the mistake. Dean Martin listened. He always had. And the more he listened, the clearer it became that the injustice was not a single sentence spoken on television, but a pattern that thrived because good men stayed quiet for the sake of comfort. Muhammad Ali, meanwhile, stood at a strange crossroads. He was celebrated and questioned in the same breath, admired for his talent and punished for his refusal to shrink. Public praise followed him everywhere, but respect was rationed. Dean noticed the small things others ignored: invitations that arrived late, seats placed slightly too far from the center, jokes framed as admiration that carried a blade underneath. Ali smiled through it all, but Dean understood that smiles could be armor, and armor grew heavy over time. The deeper conflict revealed itself slowly. It was not Ali versus a man or Ali versus a system, but dignity versus convenience. Too many people found it easier to laugh than to challenge. Too many careers were built on not rocking the room. Dean felt the pressure as well. He had a legacy to protect, contracts to honor, an image that studios trusted because it never caused trouble. Speaking up would not ruin him, but it would complicate things. And complication, in Hollywood, was its own kind of exile. The turning point came quietly, as most real ones do. Dean received an invitation to a televised tribute honoring American icons. Ali's name was included but buried. Dean read the list twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Later that night, instead of calling an agent or a producer, he called the organizer directly. His voice was calm, almost warm. He said he was honored to attend, but only if Muhammad Ali was honored properly, not as a novelty, not as a footnote, but as a man whose courage had expanded the meaning of greatness. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Excuses followed. Logistics, audience expectations. Dean listened, then said simply that he would not attend otherwise. No threats, no anger, just a line drawn with grace. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. This time it worked. The program was adjusted. Ali was moved to the center, not announced loudly but correctly. The night of the tribute, the room felt altered, as if something unseen had shifted. Dean sat where he was placed, composed as ever, hands folded, eyes attentive. Ali walked on stage to genuine applause, not polite noise. It was not redemption, but it was respect. And respect, once restored, had a way of spreading. Later, backstage, Ali approached Dean. There were no reporters nearby, no cameras hungry for meaning. Ali thanked him without ceremony. Dean shrugged slightly, as if the thanks belonged to someone else. He said that the room only needed reminding. Ali studied him for a moment, then smiled in a way that reached deeper than his usual public warmth. Two men stood there, neither needing to explain themselves further. The emotional payoff did not arrive immediately. It never does. It arrived in fragments, in the way others adjusted their tone, in the absence of certain jokes, in the presence of a new caution, not born of fear, but awareness. Dean did not claim credit. He never did. But he knew that injustice weakened when confronted calmly, when denied its favorite fuel of outrage and spectacle. By the time the world caught up to the meaning of those small decisions, it was too late to undo them. Ali carried that respect forward, not as a shield, but as confirmation that dignity could be defended without violence, without shouting. Dean returned to his life, his work, his quiet authority intact. But something had changed between them, something unspoken and enduring. And that is where part two rests, in the space between action and consequence, where a single composed choice begins to echo forward. The injustice had not disappeared, but it had been challenged. The laughter had not vanished, but it had learned restraint. And two men, bound not by friendship, but by principle, stood a little taller in a world that often asked them not to. They settle into rooms slowly, altering the air before anyone notices. Dean Martin felt it in the way conversations paused when Ali entered now, not out of discomfort, but recalibration. People were measuring their words again. Humor became careful. Praise became sincere. It was not justice completed, but justice awakened, and that distinction mattered. Dean understood that moments like these were fragile. They could either deepen into truth or collapse back into habit if left unattended. The deeper stakes revealed themselves through absence. Invitations stopped arriving for Ali from certain circles, not openly withdrawn, just never sent. Power rarely confronts openly when it feels challenged. It withdraws access and calls it coincidence. Dean noticed because he had lived long enough to recognize the tactic. Exclusion wrapped in politeness. The injustice had evolved, quieter now, harder to call out because it hid behind plausible deniability. Ali continued on with grace, but the isolation crept in around the edges, subtle and exhausting. Dean watched this not as a savior, but as a witness who understood responsibility. He had always believed that the most dangerous cruelty was the kind no one claimed ownership of. It belonged to everyone and therefore to no one. He saw Ali being praised on stage and dismissed in private, celebrated in headlines and sidelined in decisions. And he realized that the earlier stand, powerful as it was, had only cracked the door. Someone still had to hold it open. The next conflict arrived unexpectedly, wrapped in opportunity. A major network planned a live special meant to celebrate unity, a carefully branded message designed to reassure audiences rather than challenge them. Ali was invited again, but with conditions, suggested topics, softened language, boundaries disguised as guidance. Dean was also invited, positioned as the comforting presence, the familiar face who would make everything feel safe. When he read the proposal, he felt the old weight return, heavier now because the injustice had learned to sound reasonable. This time, Dean did not call. He waited. He attended the planning meeting in person, arriving early, sitting quietly, letting others speak first. Executives talked about ratings and tone and balance. Ali was discussed as an asset and a risk in the same sentence. Dean listened, his expression unchanged. When they finally asked for his thoughts, the room leaned in slightly, sensing that this was the moment something would be decided. Dean said that unity was not something you edited into existence. He said that respect could not be negotiated without losing its meaning. He spoke of Ali not as a symbol, but as a man who had already paid for his honesty in ways most people in the room had never risked. And then Dean did something unexpected. He declined his own appearance. He said the show did not need him unless it was willing to let Ali speak without conditions. No performance, no compromise, just truth. The room went quiet again, but this silence carried tension. Dean Martin walking away was not loud rebellion. It was something worse for those who relied on control. It was refusal without bitterness. The meeting ended politely, but uneasily. Days passed with no response. Ali heard rumors, fragments, nothing solid. Dean said nothing. He understood that pressure worked best when it was invisible. The decisive moment came when the network reconsidered. Quietly, without apology. Ali was invited back under new terms, which was to say, no terms at all. The special aired as planned but changed. Ali spoke plainly about dignity, about responsibility, about the cost of silence. The audience did not erupt. They listened. Some shifted uncomfortably, some nodded. Some felt seen for the first time. Dean watched from home, alone, a small smile touching his face before fading again into composure. The emotional payoff arrived later, not on screen. Ali visited Dean privately. No entourage, no press, just two men in a quiet room. Ali told him that standing alone was easier than being slowly erased. Dean replied that erasure only worked when people accepted it. They sat in silence for a while after that, not awkward, not sentimental, just present. Two lives intersecting briefly and meaningfully. When time itself becomes the antagonist, because even justice has to survive aging, fatigue, and the slow erosion of attention. The world had changed again, louder and faster, and the names that once carried weight were spoken with nostalgia instead of authority. Dean Martin felt that shift keenly. He was still respected, still welcomed, but the rooms no longer paused the way they once had. Power had passed to younger hands that knew his image more than his code. And that, he understood, was where dignity was tested most severely. Muhammad Ali was changing too, in ways no amount of courage could stop. His body betrayed him slowly, publicly, turning strength into vulnerability under the harshest lights imaginable. People watched with sympathy and discomfort, unsure how to reconcile the man they had feared and admired with the one who now moved carefully, spoke softly, and needed time. The injustice returned in a new form, just as cruel. Pity replaced respect. Admiration thinned into condescension. Ali was invited as a memory, not a voice. Dean saw it during a televised event meant to honor champions of the past. Ali was seated on stage, visible but unengaged, introduced briefly and then passed over. The camera lingered just long enough to extract sentiment, then moved on. It was not overt cruelty. That was what made it worse. It was erasure disguised as kindness. Dean watched from his chair, hands folded, his face still, but something tightened in his chest. He recognized this version of injustice immediately. It was the kind that pretended to protect while quietly diminishing. The deeper emotional tension came from uncertainty. Dean was older now. His influence had narrowed. He could not simply walk away from platforms and expect the world to bend. And yet, his moral instinct remained intact. He asked himself whether intervention would help or humiliate, whether silence would spare Ali or abandon him. It was a harder calculation now, because Ali's dignity was bound up with fragility, and any action carried risk. The turning point arrived not during the broadcast, but after. Dean requested a meeting with the event organizers. They expected nostalgia, perhaps gratitude. Instead, Dean spoke with measured disappointment. He said that honoring a man while ignoring his voice was not respect, it was control. He said that Ali's body had changed, but his meaning had not. And then he did something profoundly simple. He returned the award he had been given that night, not dramatically, not publicly. Just placed it on the table and said it no longer felt right to keep it under those circumstances. The gesture unsettled them more than any speech could have. Awards were meant to be permanent. Returned ones raised questions no press release could smooth over. Within weeks, the network invited Ali back, this time not as a symbol, but as a speaker. Accommodations were made quietly, respectfully. No emphasis on weakness. No orchestral swells for emotion. Ali spoke briefly, deliberately, and the room listened with the kind of silence that signals respect rather than pity. The emotional payoff unfolded slowly. Ali's public appearances changed tone. He was no longer framed as a farewell, but as a presence. Dean did not attend every event. He did not hover. He understood that dignity had to stand on its own to endure, but Ali knew. He always knew. In a private letter, written with care and effort, Ali thanked Dean for seeing him not as he was becoming, but as he still was. Dean read it once, folded it, and placed it with other important things, never speaking of it again. the final stretch of the story where consequences no longer arrive immediately, but linger, waiting for the moment when memory becomes judgment. By now, both men had moved into a quieter season of life. Dean Martin was no longer expected to intervene. His name carried warmth, nostalgia, reassurance. People assumed his battles were finished. Mohammed Ali, meanwhile, had become a symbol so large that many forgot he was still a man inside it, listening, feeling, remembering. And that forgetting, Dean knew, was its own final injustice. The deeper conflict of this part was not public at first. It lived in tone and omission. Tributes to Ali multiplied, but his complexity was softened. His defiance was reframed as charm. His moral courage reduced to personality. History was being polished until it no longer challenged anyone. Dean saw the danger immediately. A man honored without truth is slowly erased. Ali was being praised in ways that asked nothing of the present. And that, Dean believed, was betrayal disguised as admiration. Dean was invited to participate in a major retrospective celebrating Ali's life while he was still alive. The event promised reverence, warmth, and closure. But when Dean reviewed the script, he noticed what was missing: the conflicts, the cost, the loneliness Ali had endured not because of his fame, but because of his refusal to compromise his conscience. Dean realized that this was the final test, not of loyalty, but of honesty. Ali did not need another celebration. He needed his truth protected. This time, Dean did not request changes. He did not negotiate. He agreed to appear, knowing that his presence would be read as approval. The night arrived. The audience was filled with admiration and comfort. The speeches were elegant, safe, affectionate. Ali sat near the front, smaller now, quieter but attentive. When Dean was called to speak, the room expected charm, perhaps humor, a familiar warmth to close the evening gently. Dean walked to the podium slowly. His posture was steady. His voice, when it came, was calm and unadorned. He spoke about friendship without sentimentality, about respect without nostalgia. And then, carefully, he named the truth the room had avoided. He said that Ali had not been loved because he was entertaining, but tolerated despite being inconvenient. That the loneliness Ali had faced was not fate, but a choice others made when they valued comfort over courage. Dean did not accuse. He did not shame. He simply stated what had been true. The room changed. Applause did not follow immediately. Some people shifted. Some looked at Ali for the first time not as a legend, but as a man who had paid for his integrity. Ali's eyes filled, not with sadness, but recognition. Dean concluded by saying that Ali would never die alone, not because crowds would remember him, but because history would. And history, Dean said softly, has no use for lies told gently. The emotional payoff arrived not in cheers, but in stillness. After the event, coverage focused not on spectacle, but on substance. Younger voices began to speak differently about Ali, not as a brand, but as a conscience. Dean returned home exhausted, aware that this had likely been his final public stand, and he accepted that with peace. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded agreement. He had done what he always did, spoken only when silence would have been wrong. The way endings often do when they are earned rather than forced. There was no announcement that this would be the last chapter, no signal that the story was closing in on itself. Life simply slowed. Dean Martin's world became smaller, more private, filled with familiar rooms and fewer obligations. He was at peace with that. A man who had spent decades in the public eye understood when it was time to let the noise pass him by. Muhammad Ali's world narrowed too, not by choice, but by the steady patience of illness. Yet even as his body weakened, his presence deepened. People leaned in now, not because he was loud, but because he was still there. The final injustice revealed itself in absence rather than action. As Ali's condition became more visible, some voices began to speak for him instead of to him. They narrated his life as if it were finished while he was still listening. Phrases like legacy and farewell appeared too easily. Dean noticed this from afar, reading between lines, recognizing the same old habit of deciding when a man's meaning was complete. He felt the familiar pull to intervene, but this time he understood that his role had changed. This was no longer about correction. It was about witness. Dean did not attend many public events anymore, but he sent a note to Ali, handwritten, careful, private. In it, he did not offer encouragement or nostalgia. He simply thanked him for refusing to make his courage smaller so others could feel comfortable, thanked him for reminding people that dignity was not something you earned once and kept forever, but something you defended again and again. Ali received the note days later. He read it slowly. He did not respond in words. He did not need to. Time moved forward, indifferent and unstoppable. Dean Martin passed away first, quietly, without spectacle. The world responded the way it always does, with retrospectives and softened memories. At his funeral, the room was filled with respect rather than drama. Stories were shared carefully, laughter restrained, grief dignified. It was the kind of farewell that suited him. No one expected surprise. No one expected disruption. Then Muhammad Ali stood. It took effort. Everyone could see that. But no one moved to help him, not because they did not care, but because they understood what this moment required. Ali walked slowly, deliberately, carrying the weight of years and meaning in each step. When he reached the front, the room was already silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty, but the attentive silence that comes when people know they are about to be taught something. Ali spoke about a man who never raised his voice but changed rooms. A man who understood that justice did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrived with refusal. He spoke about the night when someone said he would die alone, and how that sentence followed him for years, not as a wound, but as a question. Ali said that Dean Martin answered that question not once, but many times, without ever announcing that he was doing so. He said that Dean did not save him. He respected him. And that respect, Ali said, was what carried him through the loneliest moments. Ali paused. His hands trembled slightly. His voice softened, but it did not break. He said that Dean Martin had been wrong about one thing only. No man who stands between cruelty and dignity ever dies alone. When Ali finally sat down, tears were visible throughout the room. Not dramatic sobs, quiet ones. The kind that come when something true has settled permanently. The story ends there, not because nothing followed, but because nothing needed to. The injustice that began with a careless sentence had been answered by a lifetime of composure. The tension that stretched across years resolved not with confrontation, but with moral clarity. Dean Martin's authority had never come from power or volume, but from restraint. Muhammad Ali's response had never been revenge, but remembrance. And in that final silence, the kind that honors rather than erases, dignity stood intact. Justice did not shout, it endured.